السلام عليكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. So tonight we said we will talk about the stories of the Quran. So this is one of those disciplines of the Quran that the scholars of the Quran, and especially the people that do the tafsir of the Quran, they focus on the stories as like a subset of things that are happening in the Quran. And one of the things about the Quran that's unique are the stories. There are so many stories in the Quran. Allah Ta'ala declares that these are the best of stories. And the stories, like the Quran, are not linear. So it's not like there's a chapter for the story of Abraham and a chapter for the story of Musa, a chapter for creation, so on and so forth. It's not linear at all. It's just like the rest of the Quran. So that's the first thing that we notice, is that the stories of the Quran are all throughout the Mus'haf. And then sometimes you'll get like a line, you'll just get a verse in the middle of a whole page of something else, and then there's like, boom, this thing happened with Nuh alayhi salam, and then Allah goes onto something else. Or like in the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, which is maybe the only exception. I think there's only one or two other references to Yusuf throughout the Mus'haf other than Surah Yusuf. That's really the only exception. Or you'll have long sections that talk about like the story of Mary alayhi salam, the birth of Christ. And of course, the biggest story in the Quran is the story of Musa and Fir'aun. Musa, Harun, alayhi salam, and Fir'aun. So one of the things that the ulama noticed about that the stories are not in chronological order or linear is that as the stories are mentioned, every time they are mentioned, there's another detail, another piece to the puzzle of the story. So while it might seem like it's repetitive, it's actually not repetitive. There are other contours to the story that you pick up when you follow the verses of a particular theme or a particular story. And they are repetitive at the same time, of course. Some of the story is the same. There's not a new chapter to the story of Moses and Fir'aun. But the reason it's also repetitive is that Allah Ta'ala the parts that are repetitive is Allah is emphasizing the importance of the story. The other thing about the stories of the prophets is the following. These are real stories. These are not metaphors. This is not fairy story or imagination or legend. These are real. These are historical stories that actually happened. Now, when I say that, a lot of people, their minds, they go to some of the historical inaccuracies that they might assume that they find in some of the stories of the prophets. But I bet you that those historical inaccuracies are not found in the Quran. They're probably something that you inherited from Judeo-Christian sources. And we all did growing up. We all thought certain things about Moses and the Ten Commandments and Charleston Heston and all of that. And then all of the different movies and you kind of inherit those things. But the Quran gives us no such details like the flood of Nuh alayhi salam, which is always a big thing. Allah Ta'ala never tells us in the Quran with any great detail the exact nature of the flood. In other words, the flood could have been local, it could have been global. Actually, it doesn't really matter. That's not the point of the story. Allah is telling us the point of the story is that, as we were mentioned in the first khutbah, is that you need that boat is going to save you, and the boat that saves you is when you bring the complementary aspects of society together. That's the point of the story. But that also doesn't mean that Nuh is like some mythological figure. No, this is something that actually happened. Part of the reason that's important to remind ourselves is one of the biggest, isms that is sort of assaulting us is the idea of Darwinism as it relates to the human condition, which posits, forget about we were monkeys and we became people. That's like, when we were growing up. No one really cares about that stuff anymore. I don't mean that. I mean that people are positing that the human condition is ever evolving, that we're ever becoming better. We were down here, and we just keep getting better. Technology is getting better. Inventions are getting better. Wealth is getting better. Society is getting better. Literacy is getting better. Healthcare is getting better. Population growth is a sign that we're getting better at healthcare and washing and so on and so forth. But that's not the narrative of the Quran. The narrative of the stories of the Quran, as an Egyptian, okay, every time I drive by the pyramids, I just say, what happened to my people? No, seriously, as an Egyptian, I love Egypt, you know that. I love everything related to Egypt. But when I passed by the pyramids, I said, those were Egyptians. And then I'm driving around looking at my fellow Egyptians say, we're not building stuff like that that's lasting thousands of years. So this idea that we were so low as a species and we evolved, the Quranic stories in general negate that narrative. وَعَلَّمَ آدَمَ الْأَسْمَاءَ كُلَّهَا. Allah says He taught Adam the names of all things, the benefit of all things. Seth, the Prophet ﷺ, most likely is the one that taught the ancient Egyptians engineering and the relationship between numbers and letters, which the Prophet ﷺ, he said, كَانَ نَبِيًّا مِنَ الْأَنْبِيَاءِ كَانَ يَحُطْ. Al-hut is when you put the number in a place of a letter. So there's a science of numerology in which each letter of an alphabet has a corresponding number. So these people were not groping in the dark, waiting for Superman and the democratic way to save them from the dark. That's not the story of society. But rather Allah Ta'ala says, وَتِلْكَ الْأَيَّامُ نُدَاوِلُهَا بَيْنَ النَّاسِ. These days we will rotate them. One people will be good and high and then they will fall. Look at the Hud, Aad and Thamud, all of these people. They had amazing industry, amazing technological advances. I mean, the ancient Egyptians I cite because people can kind of remember that. But look at the ancient Chinese civilization or ancient Japanese and see what they did and the technology that they had and the beauty that they produced. And that's another thing, from an output, from an intellectual output, we're not putting out that kind of stuff as a race like the way the people before us did. The people before us really thought about things and would stay up at night, right, literally burning the midnight oil, literally burning the oil in the candle, burning it through the night so they can write down their observations. They weren't busy with all of the distractions that we have. So I mentioned this because if you follow the stories of the Quran, you will see that these people were not without technology, we're not without knowledge, we're not without wealth or anything like that. They had power, they had wealth, they had industry, but they had different human flaws that caused them to fall and not follow the messages of the prophets. So that's another thing about the stories of the prophets that's very interesting, is that they're real. And there is a subset of people that are interested in the archaeology part of it, like people that want to find where Nuh's boat is. Me as Tarek, I'm not into that. If you want it, that's good, but I don't need to see the boat for me to believe in it. I'm happy to believe that there was a boat, and if it's on Mount Ararat or somewhere else, it's not a thing for me. But there are people that do that, especially Christians and Jews. So when the stories correspond, especially in Israel, there's a lot of digging that goes, for a lot of other reasons, but they're very much into the biblical archaeology. And unfortunately, this is an aspect in which Muslims are way behind. We're not as advanced in that as people of other faiths. The stories of the Quran also give us moral lessons. That's why they're there. And they show us the flaws that we have as a species. The love of power, the love of wealth, the love of material things, blinding us from spiritual growth. You can have all the wealth that you have. You can have all of the industry, all of the power that you could ever want. But if your heart is dead, it's useless, because you're not going to take anything. If all you think is important is material things, you're kind of on the wrong track, because you know that you're going to die. And you know that when you die, none of that material things will come with you when you die. And that's why those type of people today are the same type of people that are trying to fund like longevity projects. I want to live forever, and wouldn't it be amazing if I was 200 years old? That would suck. Can you imagine if you were 200 years old? That would be horrible. Death is a mercy. Imagine if my great-great-great-great-grandfather was still alive, and then all of the ones, I'd have to take care of all of them. No, I'm serious. You're laughing, but I'm serious. This is what our mashayikh taught us. This is death. I mean, it hurts, but it's also a mercy. Because if I had to take care of like 10 generations of my grandparents, I wouldn't be able to do anything other than take care of them. And then these people that want to live to their 2, 3, they're like, wouldn't it be amazing? It'd be like, that would suck. If to have you around for 200 years, no, 50, 60, 80 years, that's enough. Alhamdulillah, inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. But the reason they want to do that, it's a sign of a deeper spiritual problem, because they only see the tangible things. But if your heart is filled with a spiritual journey, if you've ever had real love, if you've ever fallen in love, or if you've ever connected with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or if you can remember that one time you asked Allah for something and He answered it, those moments are enough for your whole life. You don't really need anything other than that. All it is just a moment that you need. How many Sahaba did we read about that never made wudu and never prayed one rak'ah in Islam? Didn't know one verse of the Quran, but they are the Sahaba and they are martyred in battle because of that moment of belief that they had, and they charged with that belief, and they witnessed that belief, and they gave it the ultimate witness, which is they gave their life. So it's not about the quantity. So one of the reasons we have these stories is to show us the flaws that can happen to the human condition. My last set of threes, inshallah, we'll talk about the Quran, sort of some of the rules about how we read the Quran, how we carry the Quran, memorizing it, so on and so forth. But for tonight, let me end with a story. Imam al-Shafi'i radiallahu anhu is one of my, maybe top 5. Imam al-Shafi'i. Imam al-Shafi'i, one of his students was the famous Ahmad ibn Hanbal radiallahu anhu. So Imam al-Shafi'i was in Baghdad once, and he went to go visit his student, and he spent the night at his student's house. So when they woke up the next day, Imam Ahmad asked his daughter, "What do you think about our guests?" The daughter didn't know that this was Imam al-Shafi'i. And she said, "He's not a very good guest." And then Imam Ahmad said, "This is Imam Ahmad's sheikh." Said, "Why is he not a good guest?" She said, "Baba, there are 3 things. Number 1 is when I put out the food, he ate all of the food. And that's very rude. And number 2, he didn't get up in the middle of the night and pray tahajjud the way everyone did. Forget about the commentary that everyone at that time used to pray tahajjud, okay? But she said he didn't even get out of bed to pray tahajjud the way everyone did. And number 3, and worst of all, when he heard the adhan for Fajr, he got up without making wudu and he prayed Salatul Fajr." So Imam Ahmad is shocked, that this is his sheikh, his Imam, this is Ahmad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i, this is al-Shafi'i, Nasir al-Sunnah, radiallahu anhu. So he goes to Imam al-Shafi'i and he's like, "Maulana, my daughter is saying such and such." Imam al-Shafi'i, he had a bowel problem. That's actually why he died. He had an intestinal problem like his whole life. And he said, I'm always sick, and I know that the food of good people, of generous people, is a healing. And you are a good person, so I made myself eat more so I can heal the ailment in my stomach. As for tahajjud prayer, when I put my head on the pillow, I started thinking about this fiqh problem that I couldn't get out of my head, and I was working all night to solve it. And as I was on the cusp of solving it, I didn't want to get up, wash, and pray, and then I would forget it. So I needed to wait till daybreak so I can write it down. And then as for Fajr prayer, well, I didn't sleep at all. I just was lying down and thinking. So I didn't lose my wudu from Isha to Salatul Fajr. Other than the wow factor, right? But one of the morals of the story is not to judge people at how they look. As a student, when you see your mashayikh, it's very easy to judge them. Oh, the sheikh walked in with his left foot, not his right foot. Oh, the sheikh didn't pray the sunnah before Fajr prayer. Oh, the shaitan comes to you and whispers all of these things. But then when you sit down with the sheikh, you're like, "Oh my God, this is like an ocean of knowledge and I'm so ignorant," and things like that. You don't know what's on the other side, is the point of the story. You don't know you can't judge a book by its cover. Certainly couldn't judge Imam al-Shafi'i by how he looked, because if you think about his output, thank God he was spent all night thinking about these things, because he wrote them down and he solved many, many problems for the ummah in many different sciences, not just in the science of fiqh. Of course, I'm biased because I'm a Shafi'i, but we can all benefit from the story. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Maulana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.